Political mudslinging over sewage, Keir Starmer's political journey, and is it time to accept we're poorer? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, Labour peer Francis O'Grady, the New Statesman's Rachel Cunliffe and former Conservative government advisor Mo Hussein. Today, this from the Bank of England's chief economist.
Somehow in the UK, someone needs to accept that they're worse off. Are
Brits in denial about their economic plight?
Does Secretary of State agree with me that the Labour minister was talking poo?
No. Has the debate over sewage descended into a political cesspit?
Can you guarantee that under your leadership, the 2019 Labour commitments to nationalise water, energy, rail, the Royal Mail, they'll all be in Labour's next election manifesto?
I've made that commitment.
Will you nationalise the big six energy companies, yes or no?
No.
Keir Starmer has been on a journey. Is he leaving some Labour supporters behind? And the Labour leader takes on Rishi Sunak. We'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Let's start with those comments you heard in the headlines from the Bank of England's chief economist, Hugh Pill, who said that people in the UK need to accept that they are poorer. Otherwise, prices will continue to rise. That's my opening question. Catherine, with you first of all, should we just accept we're poorer?
We've just spent 500 billion quid on supporting COVID, on helping with the cost of living payment and supporting energy prices. Freedom has a cost. We had a global pandemic. We've then got Vladimir Putin and his war choosing this as the point to press go because he knew he was going to squeeze us with energy costs.
So we are poorer?
I don't want to be a counsel of despair about it. I think there's lots of positives. You know,
just yes or no, are we poorer?
In heart, no. Indefinitely not. But we've got the steps in place to make this economy grow and make us better and bigger and stronger, and we can get into that.
But for now, should we accept we're poorer, Francis?
Well, people certainly know they're poorer in their pockets. Should they accept it? Absolutely not. This hasn't been a case of equality of sacrifice. In fact, we had the IMF and the European Central Bank bringing out a report showing that 2/3 of the cause of inflation is down to profiteering. It's down to big firms upping prices and protecting their profits. Working people have taken the hits in terms of wages.
Well, you've raised the issue because actually that is some of the detail that Hugh Pill then went into, which is saying that companies should stop passing on increased energy costs to customers and be prepared to have lower profits while we're in this cost of living crisis. Do you agree with him on that, Catherine?
I think you've got to find a balance in the system, but what we've also got to do is we've got to grow the economy more. I don't accept that there's profiteering. I think that what's happened is any costs have gone up because Putin's turned the tap off, and the whole of Western Europe, including us, have been scrambling to support it.
Yeah, but should they stop passing on increased costs for now and just accept lower profits?
I don't think you can make any blanket statement to a completely independent business sector. I think we are all kind of fighting the same battle. You know, it looks like inflation is starting to come down. I think the OBR are predicting it to be back at 2%. And it's inflation that makes us poorer.
Double-digit inflation and the worst economic recovery since the pandemic.
We're the highest growing economy in the G7 since 2010.
But in terms of recovery since the pandemic, and, you know, you've got to ask what we're doing wrong. And I think the worry now is that by not raising wages, at least in line with inflation, that we're sucking demand out of the economy and people don't have money to spend in the
So you don't agree with Hugh Pill's other assessment, which is that actually employees, workers need to stop asking and demanding inflation-level pay rises, because he said that's also not the right thing to do at the moment?
I think most people in this country know that our key workers who have been forced to take strike action for better paying conditions, are absolutely right to do so. And as I say, it's actually a false economy. It's nonsense to suggest that key workers' pay is driving inflation.
Do you agree with Hugh Pill in terms of
when they've had over a
firms
decade
not having
of
high profits,
stagnating living standards?
but you want workers to still continue to demand higher wages at inflation level? Are we poorer? Do we have to accept we're poorer, Rachel?
I think Francis is right that we can all feel that we're poorer, or certainly we can feel that the wages that we had are not covering the same amount of basic essentials. It is not up for debate that there has been profiteering. If you look at something really basic like the cost of milk is up nearly 40%. That is an increase that is not to do with the increase in the wholesale price, the factory gate price. Obviously, the price of producing milk has gone up. There have been an increase in, for example, the cost of fertiliser. But it's not just that companies are passing that increase on to customers. They're passing them on to customers and then adding a sort of increase in their profit margin on top of that. That's not a left-wing conspiracy. There are investigations going on by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank into this idea of greedflation on basic essentials.
Right.
It's happening here too, and we should be talking about that just as much as we're talking about wage growth.
Do you agree with that? There's profiteering going on and that we have to accept we're poorer?
I think people feel poorer. You can see that your money is going less further than it was previously. But equally, on the business side, there are businesses who are impacted by this as well, with their own energy bills, with their own cost of supply chains, and they are seeing their margins reduced. And businesses create jobs. They need to be viable so they can create jobs, so people can get paid, and then people can hopefully see through this recession, and we end up in a better place. And there are also businesses who are doing things to help their employees with the cost of living, like providing food, providing financial advice, and providing other well-being help as well during this quite difficult time. So I don't think it's a black and white, clear-cut issue at all. And the key way of driving down inflation, in my view, is to not match inflation, because that way we end up in this spiral.
Do you think we should have pay restraint in the boardroom? I mean, they've had a 20% increase. For example, the top of the water companies, 20% on average increase.
Yeah, look, each company will have to answer to its own employees, its own customers, and people will be looking at how companies behave, how companies are building trust with their consumers and with their public as well. So I think that is important. But I do think businesses are taking steps. It's not just a clear-cut case that no business is doing anything to help.
And I think there's an important distinction between private sector wage growth in general, because you can pick individual items out, and public sector wage growth. The public sector, especially with those generous 20% pensions, they have been more protected from the difficult times that we face than the private sector. And I think it's important as a government to make sure that you're finding the right balance. But inflationary wage rises in the public sector does embed inflation. It does make us all poorer.
How can
35% for junior doctors
is a real wage
just
cut.
insane.
And public sector pay, as you should know,
do you support
is
35%
than private sector?
35% pay rise?
Don't talk over each other, but I was like, do you support 35% a pay rise? That's what junior doctors are demanding.
I tell you what I do support, and that's government getting around the table to negotiate. And in fact, why not use ACAS? That's what the junior doctors have proposed, and yet the government appears not to be using a service that's funded by the government to sort out disputes.
What do you say in response to Catherine's claim that pensions in the public sector, I should say, are higher, more broadly speaking, and that is a protection that private sector employees don't enjoy?
I mean, again, this has been looked at many, many times, and you're comparing apples and pears. What we do know is that private sector wages are not keeping up with inflation, and that public sector increases are even lower than the private sector.
Yes, there's a big disparity, it seems, between the two.
I think the reality is, the problem we all share is that key workers are voting with their feet. They're leaving big staff shortages. There's doctors leaving for Australia and New Zealand. If we don't sort it, then our NHS and our public services are in trouble.
We're going to talk about strike legislation. But, Catherine, if the government wants to say to workers and employees, you cannot have inflation matching pay rises in these disputes, do you think they should also say, in a matter of fairness, to companies that they must expect lower profits?
Well, I'm not entirely sure I completely agree with the premise of either of those. So, for example,
I'm only quoting what Hugh Pill, that's the chief economist, say both are inflationary.
Nurses, what we're trying desperately hard not to do is embed inflationary pay rises. But we got a deal there where there was a one-off in-year payment, there was a 5% pay rise, it was brokered, it was accepted by Unison, it was the RCM that held out.
And the other side, Hugh Pill said, are companies demanding higher profits and passing on higher costs to customers. That's also inflationary.
It is inflationary, right. And I think we do need to. That is why one of the Prime Minister's 5 priorities is to halve inflation. And we're
tell
still
companies to have lower profits.
I'm not going to tell a company to do anything apart from look after its people and abide by the legislation in place. But we do all have to pull together to support the Ukrainians in this context, straight after a global pandemic.
All right. Well, let's talk about these strikes. The Minimum Service Levels Bill. It's currently in the report stage in the House of Lords. The new bill would mandate minimum service levels for critical industries, even on strike days. So some workers would have to stay on duty in industries such as health, education, transport, fire service, border force and so on. You've tabled an amendment to the bill, Frances. What is it?
The amendment tries to ensure that we don't go from clapping nurses to sacking them, because that's what the bill currently provides for. I think many people feel that's fundamentally wrong. It's certainly, almost certainly, in breach of international human rights.
Why does it go to
laws.
sacking people having a minimum service level?
Because if they, for reasons of conscience, refuse to comply, then they lose their protection against unfair dismissal. Now, it seems to me, in real life, in real industrial relations, you find agreements. That's the way it works currently, where we've got those life and limb or emergency cover agreements. It's done voluntarily. It's worked very well for decades.
So you do agree with having minimum service levels?
But negotiated. And the difference is that it works, whereas if you try and do it by state diktat, I think what you're going to end up with is creating martyrs. People say, no, I just don't feel able to do that. And if they're sacked, then you can imagine that's going to cause more unrest.
Well, let me get Catherine's response. Do you have sympathy with that?
I have 2 pieces of good news for Francis. One, nobody's going to get sacked due to this legislation. And 2, actually, the bill as it stands at the moment embeds consultation. It doesn't actually embed a percentage of trains that should run or a percentage of nurses that should be on board. And actually, no, it embeds it. The consultation is by industry and includes the unions. And I think to make the broader point, we have got to balance the right to strike, which I totally support. I'm a northerner. I understand how important striking is to sets of workers. But when you're in government, you've got to balance that with the right of people to have an operation for cancer or get on a train to go to an important meeting. And I didn't interrupt your promise. So what we need to do, we were getting a bit of a hodgepodge all over the show this summer, with some people giving lots of notice and some people not. And all we're trying to do with minimum service levels is kind of standardise how we agree the minimum service level. It's not an attack on anybody's right to strike, but it is to make sure that we've got the balance for the public services that people enjoy. They can rely on a certain level of service.
I'll bring you in just a minute before Frances
responds. If this bill isn't about sacking workers, then I hope that peers right around the House will have no problem in voting for this amendment, because it simply spells out that workers should be protected. It's a fundamental freedom. They should have that protection.
Right.
But
well, let me
the Minister did also say, because I asked him specifically, that if you call in sick on the day and you're named to work, you can't be sacked. In which case, aren't we going to end up with chaos?
Well,
we're going to end up with more action.
Well, let's just focus on this. Do you see that there is scope for people to be sacked, or is that one of a sort of unforeseen consequence, if you like? Or is Catherine right, actually, embedded in this legislation is protection against that, and there will be consultation with employers and employees?
Well, one of the issues with the bill as it stands is that a lot of these details aren't in it. They're up to secondary legislation, which means that it would give ministers the right to make those decisions independent of Parliament, and they're also very broadly drafted, which means that the idea of minimum service, that isn't defined. Indeed, the industries, the sectors affected aren't defined. So you could end up with a system, with a scenario where various sectors that we wouldn't necessarily think as crucial for life and limb, the government could say, no, we think that there need to be minimum service levels too. It's too broad and it gives too much power to ministers after Parliament.
You're looking sceptical.
Yeah, but I think this is where the consultation part of it does come into it, because I think this is quite a maximalist approach from the government. I don't think there's a real appetite to fully use this legislation, but there has to be some response they have to the enormous strikes and disruption we have seen, and there needs to be more of a dividing line with the Labour Party. So I think the people, the employers and the employees are the ones who have to get around and decide, well, what do you mean by minimum service levels? And you talk about education, well, within that, what does it actually look like and which part of education are you talking about? I don't think that's for ministers to decide. And if I was a government advisor, I would not want to be making those decisions. I would want the sector to have a role in actually making those decisions.
Fundamentally, the big problem with this bill is that we don't have a system of indentured servitude when it comes to the NHS or teachers or rail workers in this country. People, as Francis said, are voting with their feet. We've got a system at the moment, a scenario where there are 130,000 vacancies in the NHS. Doctors and nurses know that if they're not getting the salaries and the working conditions that they feel are appropriate to their level, they can move to Australia, they can move to Europe, they can move to America and get paid more.
Yeah, but on that point, I don't think the Labour movement can have it both ways. The EU is some kind of workers' paradise, but lots of countries in the EU have got minimum service level legislation.
They do.
Spain has, Germany has, Italy has.
They're all negotiated.
And I think it's a very clear... Exactly. We're consulted on and negotiated on. It's in the bill.
No, because
I think start with blue light. Let's not scaremonger it, but let's recognise that
the bill, as it stands, gives the power to define it.
Don't talk over each other.
It gives that power to ministers. So you're saying blue light only. That's not in the bill. It's up to a future government, future ministers, to decide what counts as minimum service levels, and that won't be voted on in Parliament.
It's a negotiation. It's a negotiation and consultation by industry with an ambition to start on blue light services. What was happening in the summer was some areas were giving 2 hours notice, some areas were giving 24 hours notice. It was a nightmare to actually plan a minimum service level negotiation. The junior doctors aren't giving any, they're not adhering to any minimum service level. Tell that to the person whose operation has been cancelled. We have to balance the rights of the public with the right to strike.
This is totally disingenuous. The bill does not provide for agreement. And please answer the question. If it's so brilliant, why are the NHS providers, the employers, don't want it? Because it will damage industrial relations. They're already saying it's making it harder to settle the disputes that we have, knowing this
I'm unashamedly on the side of the users.
Is in the background. And I think we have to deal with the root causes of those disputes rather than
All right, well, let's get on to some of the root causes. Obviously, we know it's about pay and wages. We've had a bit of a discussion about that. But actually, Catherine, what's interesting is that the Office for National Statistics is saying that the number of days lost through strike action is having a real impact on growth, on the economy, the very thing that you want to see as a government, that everybody wants to see. Wouldn't it actually make economic sense to improve a settlement in some of these areas, particularly nurses who are going on strike again at the weekend, and get the economy growing again?
Well, let's go back to the nurses. So there was a negotiated settlement of an in-year payment and a 5% benefit, and it was accepted by Unison, which is the vast majority.
But it was rejected
by
the RCN.
And it was rejected by the RCN relatively narrowly. So the idea that the government isn't negotiating and trying to find a settlement that we all want, I think is really important.
And would it be better to go back and improve on that in order to get those people back to work? And
to be fair, if I was the Health Secretary, he wouldn't thank me for kind of opining on what is a difficult job that I know he's working very, very hard at. But I think the idea that we are doing anything other than trying to find the best way forward to deliver the British people, we're all working hard to try and fix it.
How should a pay rise be paid for? One over and above the offer that was on the table. Let's just take the nurses, for example. How would it be paid for?
Well, it sounds like the Treasury has already found a load of money down the back of the sofa, doesn't it? So I think there is money available. But
how would you pay for it? I mean, let me just give you or remind our viewers the sorts of costs we're talking about. It would cost £18 billion to give a 10.1% pay rise. That's the level of inflation to all public sector pay workers. Is that what you would like to see? I mean, that's a large amount of money, but that would probably resolve the strike.
That money doesn't, by the way, include the savings you'd make on benefits, because so many public sector workers are now dependent on in-work benefits.
How would you like to see that paid for if you were in favour of that?
I would look at it's about priorities and choices. It's about investing. Our public services have been underinvested in for over 10 years. But also it's about a fairer tax system. Abolishing non-dom status.
That raises just over $3 billion, which Labour has already committed to use to actually fund more nurses and doctors.
I would also look at equalising capital gains tax. I think it's wrong that a private equity owner of a care home pays a lower rate of tax than the care worker on average on less than £10 an hour. That feels wrong, and it would raise big money. So there are things you can do, and I think it is.
And you'd like to see Labour take on something like equalising capital gains with income tax rates?
I think Labour should look at that alongside some of the other changes. But I think it ultimately is about choices and priorities. And all of us know that the NHS is in real trouble. And that's why I think Labour has made it a priority, that sorting out the backlog.
But not committing any more cash than, as you say, the £3.2 billion, which isn't insignificant.
It isn't insignificant,
but it's certainly not going to pay for those pay rises.
The doctors we need.
I mean, that would resolve these pay disputes, which, as Catherine says, it's about the users. It's about people having their operations cancelled. Maybe they would like to see that sort of level of investment going into pay rises.
But then it wouldn't deal with inflation, which we all want to see come down. And I think that is the key thing that we should be looking to achieve. And also, the Labour Party haven't actually committed to this, because it goes back to fiscal credibility and a bit of keeping your powder dry, I guess, before an election. But just committing to these kinds of pay rises without them being fully costed, or if that money is being used to pay what about other frontline services, is going to be quite challenging. So I think you will see this prevarication from Labour front bench on this.
I mean, it's not entirely true that pay rises in the public sector will increase inflation. You've had the head of the IFS and you've had a number of top economists say that it's not the same as pay increases in the private sector, because it doesn't increase the cost of an operation in the same way onto the consumer, because that's not how public services are funded. You've had a number of top economists say that that argument that it is inherently inflationary just isn't true. It's not accurate. It is true that there is a shortage of money, and we have to make some very tough decisions about how that money is allocated and make sure that these things are costed. But you've also got to look at it holistically. How many work days are lost because people are dealing with untreated healthcare conditions and they can't get the operations for them? How many work days are being lost because parents are having to look after their children during school strikes? I'm taking my stepchildren into the New Statesman office next week because their school is closed.
That'll be fun for them, won't it?
For everyone involved. This has a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. It has a knock-on effect on safety levels within the NHS. It's not simply a case of saying, this is what we can afford, deal with it.
Let's have a look at some of the political strategy and political tactics that have been adopted by the parties in recent weeks. Show you this from the Labour Party. This is a big issue, of course, about sewage being dumped in rivers and seas. Labour will end the Tory sewage scandal. Do you think it's right to allow raw sewage to be dumped into our rivers and beaches 800 times a day? Rishi Sunak does. Francis, do you really think Rishi Sunak wants to dump sewage 800 times a day into our rivers and beaches?
Well, I think one of the delights of social media is you can only say things in a few words.
So they don't have to be true.
No. Well, he is the leader, he is the Prime Minister, and ultimately my understanding of being the Prime Minister is that, you know, you take responsibility for what's going on in the country. And if sewage is being dumped every 2.5 minutes, I think, and again, you know, water companies, I mean, privatisation there was such a rip-off, have to say. It hasn't delivered the investment, it hasn't delivered lower prices. really. I think most people feel people are being rewarded for failure, frankly, when you look at what's happened to our
Well, failure may be one thing,
else.
but this sort of says he really wants to do it. Rishi Sunak wants to allow raw sewage to be dumped into our rivers and beaches that many times a day.
Well, I guess he's got an opportunity to prove he doesn't want it, hasn't he, by getting tough on the water companies that are not doing their job. I mean, if a worker was not doing their job in that way, I think they'd get disciplined.
Let's talk to Catherine then about this from the Conservative Party campaign website. This is about the small boats and the illegal migration bill. They call it the Stop the Boats bill. Labour have a choice to back our bill or back people smugglers. But they won't back our bill. Why? Because the truth is Labour don't want to stop the boats. Do you really believe that Labour don't want to stop the boats, that they back people smuggling?
They've voted against loads of measures to try and sort the people smugglers out. But I think there's a common thread to both of these points, which is, you know, governing is not a series of positive choices. It's a series of not particularly fun choices a lot of the time. So, and what I observed yesterday, especially in the sewage debate, was the Labour Party making a total Horlicks of trying to do some kind of quite clever political campaigning and ending up sitting on the benches, not voting for their own,
this is about the
own motion.
But on the small boats, I mean, is that really what you think, that Labour, because they're not backing the government bill on this, back people smugglers instead and don't want to stop the boats?
If you don't put your shoulder to the wheel to stop the incentives for people paying granny's life savings to cross the channel in a really dangerous way, then I do think that you have a right to answer. And when you listen to the Labour Party talk both in public and in private, they are all over this, all over the show in terms of what we need to do. We've got some people still advocating for free movement. I would make the general point, which is I personally don't like these attack ads. I don't, in general, retweet them. But it's time immemorial in terms of, you know, you start quoting Churchill's more waspish stuff. But I would like to see the Labour Party spend a lot less time playing games and actually setting out what they would do. The sewage one's a classic. We've inherited a Victorian plumbing system. The truth is, it's either 590-odd billion...
Or fine the company.
Yeah, well, what they're supposed to do, invent like 200 million diggers. So, you know, it's to go and fix the problem.
All right, but
we could turn them all off, but the truth is, people would end up with sewage backed up in their houses, in their streets. If we've got billions going in to invest in it, but there is not a switch you can flip.
But that is the substance, which of course is very important. But does it work? What does the public make of this style of attack ads, as Catherine calls them?
Look, I think it does work because the context is we're in election mode now, and the public people generally respond to sound bites, short, sharp messages, pictures. I would argue there's too many words on both of those images, but you're probably going to remember that more than you will remember the PM speech or Keir speech from 6 weeks ago, for half an hour long, beyond one or two headlines. So if you want cut through with the public, then the fact that we're still talking about this, and we have been for a while, means the objective has been achieved. And you can debate about whether it's factually correct, but you're talking about the wider issue. You're talking about the government's record on something or the opposition's record. And that means you're not talking about something that might be a weaker point for yourself, and therefore you have done what you wanted to do.
It's just interesting, the words that are used. Labour doesn't want to stop the boats. The Conservatives, or Rishi Sunak, wants to dump sewage into the rivers and seas. The motivation behind it, does that work? Does that resonate with the public?
I mean, I think Mo is absolutely right in that these kind of short, punchy statements attaching blame or attaching statements to individuals, they are effective. I don't like them either. I don't think they're a particularly new thing. And I think that the amount that we're getting upset and sort of fixating on whether or not they're fair, politics is a tough game and it's a dirty game. But one of the reasons that I think that the Conservatives in particular are very upset about the Labour ones at the moment is Labour has 13 years worth of ammunition, things that are falling apart. It's wonderful that the Conservatives have voted to have legally binding targets for water companies and sewage. But you do have to ask, how did we get into this position? How did no one in the last 13 years look at the state of our sewage system, look at the state of our water companies and go, maybe we should act on that?
The only
Why
reason
didn't
we
you act
know
13
is
years
because
ago?
we made them put monitors on to understand the size of the problem. It was 7% in 2010 and it's 90-odd%. Know the problem that you've got to fix. But I think with these attack ads, is one thing that they have to be, which is true. You know, the Rishi
Well,
loves,
it's not true that Keir Starmer
Rishi loves
personally
kind of
supports the
child
trafficking
abuser
gangs.
stuff.
It's not.
Come on,
It's not true
absolute nonsense.
that Keir Starmer personally supports the trafficking gangs. That's a Conservative attack ad, and that isn't true.
At the risk of sounding like the world's biggest school playground, which incidentally totally turns everybody off in Lancashire and Leyland, you guys started it with that total mess of an attack ad, which I thought was completely beyond the pale, bringing children into politics.
You started it. I couldn't get Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, last Wednesday, sitting there after PMQs, to repeat the words on that particular attack ad, which is that Rishi Sunak either backs or doesn't want to put child sex offenders in prison.
I mean, my sense is that we've had 13 years, that what is chiming with ordinary people is that sense of the country falling apart, that you can't get a GP appointment, that the sewage, you can't go for a swim in the river, that, you know, everything.
So isn't there enough just to attack? Isn't there just
working.
enough to attack them on their record in the way that Rachel has said, rather than on motivation? And the same with the Conservatives.
I'm old school. I, always prefer dealing with policies rather than personalities and all of that. But I also believe that if you do take a top job, then you have to be held accountable. That is part of the rough and the smooth of being the leader of a country.
And people know who Rishi Sunak is.
People do, but just on that point, there are things that can be debated and can be attacked. But this seems to me to be a bit of the dead cat strategy, and we've seen both sides use it, where you say something so outrageous and you create this diversion that people then talk about it and maybe don't focus on your own Achilles heel in that very area.
I'd love to point out an example of that, and in terms of who started it, I'm not a member of the Labour Party, so it certainly wasn't me, but I'd like to know what Catherine thought of Boris Johnson blaming the Jimmy Savile case on Keir Starmer. If you want to look at who started it and where the nastiness in politics came from, I really think that you have to go back to that moment, if not before.
You can look at what I actually do, which is I've spent the last 2 weeks in Leyland telling people about reopening a police station. I don't, in general, use attack ads. I try to be as positive. I tell people what we've done for them. I ask them what they want us to do in the future. That's how I conduct myself.
Francis, do you think this sort of strategy should perhaps be pushed to the background, or do you think it does actually work and you can take the heat for it?
I think people do believe politicians have to be held to account, and I do believe that's part of, taking on a role, including in the trade union movement. Occasionally you get times when it doesn't feel too comfortable and you're being called to account, but that's the job. That's taking public office.
Now, what did you think, just before we move on, Catherine, when Boris Johnson did accuse Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, of failing when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile?
I know we've done a big thing where we've kind of listed out Sir Keir Starmer's record for DPP, and to my great shame, that I haven't actually read it yet. So I don't actually know what his actions were in that case. I've not. It's my fault. I've not.
It was a right-wing conspiracy theory. It was a dog whistle to a right-wing conspiracy theory that isn't true and that is incredibly damaging to public discourse.
But I think it is legitimate to check his record when he was DPP. Some of the quotes Emily Thornley was coming out with.
That this wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. We're going to look at this story in BBC News. Labour membership falls by 90,000, according to the latest accounts. Labour has just over 430,000 members, had that at the end of 2021, according to those accounts published by the party last summer. Now, one of those who has left, decided to quit the party, is Anne McCarthy. She's a journalist. She was a member of the Labour Party for 6 decades until she decided to leave last summer. And that was because, broadly speaking, Keir Starmer's policies on Brexit, as well as on the economy and other issues. She's with us now. Hello to you, Anne. Does Labour no longer represent working people in your mind?
I think Labour definitely no longer represents the sort of working people I'm a part of. I'm a professional working person, and his policies more and more don't represent the people who are in the unions, the people who are striking. No, it doesn't represent working people as I class them.
Frances, what would you say to Anne? How would you convince her to come back into the party?
I had the pleasure of meeting Anne briefly just outside before we started, and we reckon we must have joined the party at a very similar age. I was both teenagers, been through similar, I suspect, experiences, thick and thin, with the Labour Party. The reasons I'd ask Anne to think again, number one is the New Deal for Workers that Angela Rayner launched with the backing of trade unions and the TUC, which is about every worker having day one rights as soon as you start work, basic rights like sick pay, getting rid of 0 hours contracts and having the right to guaranteed hours, and fair pay agreements, starting with social care, which I suspect you, like me, feel passionately about treating that workforce with a bit of fairness after everything they've been through.
All right, well,
also issues like, women's rights, crimes against women, and the NHS.
Let Anne respond. Anne, are you convinced? What would you say to Frances?
No, I'd say to Frances, I left the Labour Party very briefly when Keir broke the relationship with CND. I came back in when John Smith was the leader. I almost left when Tony Blair, whom I knew personally and professionally reasonably well, I almost left when he became leader. I stayed in to fight from the inside against policies that I suspected, rightly as it turned out, would often not be the ones I wanted. I have seriously considered coming back in, but everything I've seen, I left in August because of Brexit policies. I thought Starmer should be aligning himself quite firmly with as much as possible with the EU. I would have rejoined in the autumn, but each time I thought, OK, I'll go back. Starmer came out with another policy announcement, which I didn't like. Yes, Frances is quite right. Some of the things that are coming out now from about workers' rights, some of the things about green policy are attractive, and I will probably vote for them when they come out as things come up. But Starmer appears to me not prepared to listen to the membership. I think he's misguidedly looking at the red wall seats and thinking he's going to convince working people in the West Midlands with his policies. I know a fair bit about the West Midlands. I grew up on the Shropshire-Wales border.
All right.
And I don't think he's going to be convincing, so I'd rather stay out.
I'm just going to interject to welcome viewers from BBC News. You're watching Politics Live with our guests here. We are talking about the Labour Party and talking to someone who has quit the party relatively recently because she doesn't feel that Labour represents working people anymore. Catherine, your working class background represent a seat. You would like to talk to someone like Anne. She's left the Labour Party. Could you persuade her to join you?
I think Anne sounds like a really clever lady, and the Shropshire-Welsh border is a really beautiful part of the world, so it's a fantastic childhood. I think the question for the Labour Party is probably why is somebody not like me a member of the Labour Party, honestly. I was raised in Manchester when Sir Graham Stringer was leader of the council. My dad's a Labour man, my granddad was a co-op milkman. What was it that when I sat down 10 years ago and read all the manifestos, actually it felt that the Conservative Party was my natural home? And it's a mixture of responsibility with your money, the values and the type of society you want to be in, and we are broad church coalitions in the Conservative and the Labour movement, but ultimately you cannot overturn a democratic vote and say that you want to rejoin the EU.
Right, well, on Brexit aside, Anne, do you like what you've heard there from Catherine?
No, I'm never going to join the Conservative Party. And look at the sort of area, North Shropshire, where I very much did a lot of my growing up. I think I'd be more likely if I was there to vote Lib Dem or Green.
All right.
And if I was on the other side of the border, I might vote Plaid Cymru by this stage.
All right. Well, anything else you can say?
I know I can't have a cup of tea with everybody who's left the party, but I'd love to have a cup of tea with you, Anne.
Let me just show you. Thank you very much, Anne. But stay with us for a little bit longer while we continue the discussion. George Eaton, colleague at the New Statesman, has done an interview with John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor. He accuses Labour of intimidatory bullying towards Jeremy Corbyn and says there's clearly a faction who seem to be more interested in destroying the left than in winning the next election. Just explain some of the context of that.
Firstly, I should say it's John McDonnell who's making those accusations, not my colleague George.
No, he's tweeted it.
Who's tweeted it. And yes, you can read this interview in this week's edition of the New Statesman magazine. But look, the left wing of the Labour Party is in crisis at the moment. Diane Abbott has had the whip withdrawn. McDonnell is the only one of the Corbyn project who is still a Labour MP. And there is a huge amount still of anxiety and upset over the fact that Jeremy Corbyn will not be standing as the Labour candidate in Islington North, my constituency. He might stand as an independent, we don't know. And there is still a refusal, I think, among the Corbyn supporters to accept the reasons for that decision by Keir Starmer, which are to do with his reaction to the report into anti-Semitism in the party. He said, even after seeing all of the evidence, that he thought the problem had been exaggerated. He refused to accept the findings, and it is his response that has meant that he has been deselected as the Labour candidate in that seat, and the left wing of the party are very upset about that.
Right. I mean, and do you think the treatment of the left side of the Labour Party has been fair?
No, I don't. Corbyn is also my MP, and whether he stands as an independent or not, of course, is for the future. He may not. I think the other parts of I don't think of myself as left. I think of myself as sort of centre-left. Other parts around the country, similar things have been being done in other constituencies. Islington North is obviously the highest profile one because of Corbyn's position. I think the treatment of Corbyn going back to when the whip was taken away is very stupid. I think Keir Starmer could have just quietly returned the whip a year ago.
All right. Anne McCarty, thank you very much for joining us. What do you say to that in terms of the treatment of the left and Jeremy Corbyn, Francis?
I think Labour wins as a broad church, but I also think our values really matter, including anti-racism, and that we all have to have a bit of humility, that we've all, right across the board, got stuff to learn on that.
All right, let's go into the chamber, because in 5 minutes' time we will be watching and listening to Prime Minister's questions. There are MPs filling up at the moment. In fact, Maria Caulfield, who will be our guest after Prime Minister's questions, is at the dispatch box there, the Health Minister. It's the first PMQs, Catherine, since Dominic Raab, the former Deputy Prime Minister, resigned over bullying allegations. He said he would go if any of those were upheld, and 2 of them were by Adam Tolley, who carried out the investigation. He becomes the third Cabinet Minister to resign with Rishi Sunak. Can you understand why some of your colleagues are worried that Rishi Sunak just doesn't have their backs?
No, I think Rishi's doing a great job. And I'm not entirely sure I agree with the premise of the question, to be honest.
Well, it's because a group of MPs, the Common Sense group of Conservative MPs, went to Chequers, to the Prime Minister's retreat, to talk to them about the fact that he would have their backs in situations like this, rather than perhaps allowing, as some people within the party feel, civil service activism.
I know a couple of people that went to that. They really enjoyed it. I think it was really nice. a pleasant opportunity to engage with colleagues. I was actually talking to Francis before we kicked off about what it was like to be a 2019 MP and to be an MP for like 5 weeks and then effectively a Zoom MP, and in this game, which is a people game. But no, I think the sense is the Prime Minister's actually doing a really good job. You know, there's people starting to look forward. Love the 5 priorities, because it's what people talk to us about when you go and knock on doors, like in Leyland. Stop the boats, you know, cut the waiting lists, halve inflation, reduce debt.
All right, you're doing your campaign thing. But actually, there are also people, Rachel, who feel that Rishi Sunak should have just sacked Dominic Raab. Do you think the whole Dominic Raab saga has strengthened or weakened the Prime Minister?
I think he's got away with it for now, but I think the timing between the announcement that Rishi Sunak had the report and us seeing the report, which was, nearly 24 hours, speaks volumes. Also, the fact that Dominic Raab was able to release his resignation letter, which is one of the pettiest and most bitter resignation letters I have ever seen in my career, and indeed then write an op-ed for The Telegraph about how poorly he had been treated before Rishi Sunak made any statement at all. That's not a sign of strength, that's a sign of dithering.
Look, there's always an element of choreography in these things, but when you're a Prime Minister who is wholly dependent on his backbench MPs for support because you don't have the popular vote and you don't even have the members supporting you, it's quite a challenge making sure that all of these factions are going to be supportive. And someone like Dominic is not going to go in the backbenches and cause a lot of trouble for the PM. He's not a Truss person. He's not really anymore, I would say, even a Boris person now. So there will be MPs who feel uncomfortable that the PM, in their view, has chosen the civil service over them. But I think him not being fired by the PM, whilst it may to some look a bit weak, actually politically was the right thing for the PM to do, and just him walking away.
I mean, there are real members of staff on the end of this. I mean, that 24 hours not only was about whether the Prime Minister looked like he was dithering and in the end didn't sack him but let him resign. There were real people who had the guts to submit bullying complaints who
have now been named.
Yeah, and that's why it was investigated.
Okay, and I think we do need to reform that procedure because if it's left to a Prime Minister, it's a political decision rather than a fair decision for those
did the right thing.
staff.
It's not. It's not black and white when you read what's in it. The Prime Minister's done the right thing, which is taken time to think about a really complex subject. But I would make the broader observation that a lot of the briefing that was going on in the press, there's not one tomato in that report. I think giving Dominic the opportunity to say, I completely accept and have resigned because of these two things. However, please can we be clear that you can't just go around making stuff up about sitting ministers and then briefing out to the press as truth when it then doesn't appear in a report. I agree people have a right to be treated with respect at work, of course they do, but the Prime Minister spending a bit of time to examine a challenging report, I think that's good leadership. That's the turbo nerdery we've known to come and love.
Did he actually come to a decision or did you just wait for him to resign?
I haven't spoken to him about it.
Well, it doesn't look very convincing. I'm just looking at it through the eyes of a staff member. You've put in that allegation of bullying. You go through a process. There's a report. It's tough. It's a tough thing to do because you have less power than the person you're complaining about, and that's the reality. We've seen it with sexual harassment. We've seen it with bullying. It's why you have to have a much more robust procedure that people have trust in.
I mean, how do you think the backbenchers are feeling as this is the first Prime Minister's question since that all happened? Mo, sitting behind Rishi Sunak. You may not have time to answer that question because I think he's answering himself.
The UK will continue to work to end the bloodshed in Sudan and support a democratic government. We have begun a large-scale evacuation of British nationals, and I pay tribute to all those carrying out this complex operation. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the opposition grabbed a crude headline about teaching boys to have respect for women, an important issue I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree. But, given that the Leader of the Opposition apparently doesn't know what a woman is, that he won't stand up to defend women in his own party, voicing views on women's rights, and according to his own front bench, failed to prosecute rapists when he was in charge as DPP. Does my right honourable friend think that the Labour Party are in any position to teach anyone about respect for women? And is the irony dead?
Right,
I'm going to bring the plows in, but in fairness, these are responsibility for the answer to the opposition, but Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The leader of the opposition's record on women is questionable at best, Mr. Speaker. And before Labour do start preaching about this issue, they should work out the answer to one very simple question. I'm certain what a woman is he?
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the brave British personnel involved in the evacuation effort from Sudan? The government must do everything in its power to urgently evacuate UK nationals still trapped in Sudan. Mr. Speaker, yesterday George Osborne said that the Tory party's handling of the economy makes them vandals. He's right, isn't he?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while we're in the business of quoting former chancellors and shadow chancellors, I don't know if he saw the remarks from a former Labour shadow chancellor yesterday, who said our country had faced 4 once-in-a-century shocks, threats to our economy, and the fact that we've come through it is a triumph, Mr. Speaker.
Well, that former Chancellor not only said there were a bunch of Tory vandals, he also said there was a self-induced financial crisis on the country. That's those vandals. And they like to pretend that it was all just 1 week of madness last autumn. But the truth is, it's been 13 years of failure. Real wages, the money in people's pockets, have fallen by £1,600 per household. £1,600. The Prime Minister's response? To impose 24 Tory tax rises in 3 years. 24. How on earth does he think his low-growth, high-tax economy is working for working people?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, because of the action that we've taken on the national living wage at record levels, on pension, on universal credit, and the generous cost of living payments. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, almost 8 million households receiving direct support from this Conservative government. We are supporting working people. But just this week, Mr. Speaker, in the other place, we've seen his party side with protesters and with picketers. He should actually try backing working people.
Lost £1,600 worse off. Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely fascinated to know, does he really think that everything's fine, or is he just clueless about life outside of his bubble?
Mr. Speaker, because of the actions that we have taken, well, let's just go over it. A single mother working full-time on the national living wage this year will get £1,300 more support from this government. A working couple on low income with 2 children will get £1,800, Mr. Speaker. That's what delivering for working Britain looks like. But if he has any actual ideas for the economy, he should say so, because all I hear from the party opposite, it's more spending, more borrowing, higher inflation, higher interest rates. It's the same old Labour Party.
This is Mr. 24 tax rises. And I've never heard anything so out of touch as the answer that he has just given. And it's not just his refusal to take any responsibility for the damage they've done, the crashed economy, the hit to living standards. It's also he refuses to take the action that's needed. He could stop the handouts he's giving to oil and gas giants. He could scrap his beloved non-dom status. He could put that money back in the hands of working people and get the NHS back on its feet. That's what a Labour government would do. Why doesn't he?
Mr. Speaker, the record was clear. Look at it right now. Record numbers of people in work, Mr. Speaker. Record numbers of people in work. Inequality lower. The number of people in poverty lower. Those in low pay, the lowest numbers on record, Mr. Speaker. He talks about this non-dom thing. I think he's already spent the money that he claims he'd raised on 5 different things, Mr. Speaker, because it's the same old Labour Party. They're always running out of other people's money.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. I had enough last week. I'm certainly not having this continuous noise. So just be aware that somebody will be going for that cup of tea today. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he calls it this non-dom thing. Let's be honest about what his refusal to scrap the non-dom status means. It means that at every possible opportunity, he has voted to put taxes up on working people, while at the same time taking every possible opportunity to protect a tax avoidance scheme that helped his own finances? Why is the Prime Minister telling people across the country that their taxes must go up so that his can stay low?
Mr. Speaker, the facts are these. The very wealthiest pay more tax and the poorest pay less tax today than under any year of the last Labour government, Mr. Speaker. We've also boosted the national living wage, boosted universal credit and pensioners. But, Mr. Speaker, the rank hypocrisy of it, as we saw last week, when it comes to his own special pension scheme. I said it last week, but I'll say it again. It's literally one law for him and a tax rise for everybody else.
Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. I'd scrap his pension giveaway whether it affected me or not. He refuses to scrap the non-dom status that benefits him and his family. I can see why he's attracted to this non-dom thing. This Prime Minister is so removed from the country that he boasted that he didn't know a single working-class person. So insulated from reality that he proudly told a Tory garden party how he'd moved money from poorer areas and handed it to rich ones. So out of touch that he looks at a petrol pump and a debit card like they've just arrived from Mars. Is it any wonder that he smiles his way through the cost of living crisis while putting other people's taxes up? Is it any wonder he doesn't have a clue how food prices are hammering families across the country? And is it any wonder that under him people are paying more and more and getting less and less?
Mr. Speaker, we'll just look at what's happened just in this week, Mr. Speaker, where the Labour Party have put themselves. On Monday, in the other place, they decided to side with extremist protesters. Just yesterday, they sided with polluters, Mr. Speaker. And tonight we will see them siding with the people smugglers, Mr. Speaker. I tell you this, whilst we're in the business of sending back the 1,000th illegal migrant from Albania, Mr. Speaker, we're delivering cost of living payments to millions of households just yesterday, and today we've announced we put 20,000 more police officers on the street, Mr. Speaker. We're siding with the British people, Mr. Speaker. That's what the Conservative government does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 years ago, Goulburn Urban District Council wrote to the government about the urgent need for a bypass for my constituency of Lee. 40 years ago, the central section of that bypass, the Atherley Way, was constructed. But to this day, the bypass remains unfinished, leading to daily gridlock in some areas of the community. Will the Prime Minister support my proposals to complete the Atherley Way, and will he meet with me to discuss this further so we can get Lee moving again?
Mr. Speaker, I commend my honourable friends campaigning on this issue, and I know there have been a number of proposals for road improvements in his area. He will know that it's for the local highways authority to develop those plans, but I know a meeting is planned in June to move proposals forward, and I know he will take his energy and enthusiasm for his campaign to that meeting, and I wish him well.
We come to SNP spokesperson Stephen Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister to outline the safe and legal route available to a child refugee seeking to flee Sudan and come to the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I outlined earlier, our priority in Sudan, first and foremost, was to evacuate our diplomats and their families, which I'm very pleased. We were one of the first countries to be able to do, Mr. Speaker. And since yesterday, we've been conducting a large-scale evacuation of British nationals. We have some of the largest numbers of British nationals on the ground, and rightly, and I'm sure the whole House will agree with me, that it is reasonable, legal and fair to prioritise those most vulnerable families, particularly those with elderly people in them, medical conditions, but also children, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're in the process of doing, and I pay tribute to all those who are making it possible.
Leader of the SNP.
Mr Speaker, to be clear, and I think everyone in the House is aware of this, children in Sudan are already dying. Now, whether it's a Tory slogan to stop the boats or a Labour slogan to stop small boats, we need some more humanity in this debate, rather than the race to the bottom which we see here today. So can I ask the Prime Minister, now that he has confirmed that there is no safe and legal route, will he therefore confirm that it would be his government's intention to detain and deport a child refugee who flees Sudan and comes to the United Kingdom?
Mr Speaker, in fact, because of the efforts of our aid teams, we've invested almost £250 million in humanitarian support in Sudan over the past 5 years. And Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman does it always, but actually this country has a proud record of compassionately supporting those who need our assistance. Just over the last few years, we have welcomed almost 500,000 vulnerable people to our country, including many children, and it's that compassion that we want to make sure we continue, Mr Speaker, which is why it's precisely right that we make sure that our system is not exploited by those coming here illegally, and that's what our bill will deliver.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Mr Speaker, the Lib Dem-run Hinckley and Bosworth Borough Council don't have an up-to-date local plan. So that every day that goes past, we have speculative housing applications that put pressure on the infrastructure like GP surgery, schools and roads. Now, locally, the Lib Dems say it's the 300,000 housing target the government has. Yet the Lib Dems have a target of 380,000 houses now. So will the Prime Minister change the law to ensure that communities like Burbage, Barwell, Markfield and Market Bosworth get the infrastructure and protection they need for the houses that we need?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is right to point out the hypocrisy of the local Liberal Democrats on this issue. And he's right to highlight this issue locally, because the new infrastructure levy does give local areas the power to deliver the local infrastructure that he supports and wants for his area. But also, he's absolutely right to point out the importance of a local plan, because it is precisely that having a local plan is what gives communities the power to ensure that development in their area is happening in the way that they want it to, and the council is failing in its duty to do that for its communities by not putting forward that local plan.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Well, incredibly, any traveller wanting to go by train from North to South Wales has to go via England. Linking Wales north to south would cost £2 billion. Now, the PM talks about running away with other people's money, but his government is depriving Wales to the tune of £6 billion by ruling that north-south England rail links like HS2 somehow benefit Wales. Will he plead guilty to the Great Welsh Train Robbery?
Well, Mr Speaker, as the honourable lady knows how transport matters are handled in Wales, and what I would say to her is that we do always want to work cooperatively with the Welsh Government to see where we can deliver jointly for people in Wales. We're actually investing record sums in communities up and down Wales through the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Ownership Fund. We're happy to continue those conversations. Many of those are transportation projects, and I think hopefully she'll join me in saying what the people of Wales do not need is the Labour Welsh Government's plan to ban all building of new roads.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will the Prime Minister back our local plans to reopen our much-loved Malvern Hills College? And does he agree that Warwickshire College Group should negotiate the sale in good faith and not resort to using public money to sue our district council?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue. I, of course, recognise the valuable work that all colleges do in meeting local skills need, and very much welcome local community groups working together to address gaps in the way that her local area is doing. My understanding is that my honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is in discussion with the college, and I know that my honourable friend will continue making representations to her.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent, Ian Greenwood, tragically lost his 12-year-old daughter in a road traffic collision that should never have happened. Ian's now campaigning for Leeds Vision Zero, which aims to end road deaths and serious injuries by 2040. We really have to make our roads much safer. So will the Prime Minister commit to giving local authorities sufficient funding in order to ensure that these vehicle collisions can never take a young life again?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm incredibly sorry to hear about the tragic loss of Ian's daughter. Of course, we should do everything we can to improve road safety. I know actually at the moment that we are doing an enormous amount and the statistics show that it's improving, but we're always happy to look at where we can do more, and I know the Transport Secretary will look into the suggestions raised by the honourable gentleman.
Roberts.
Mr. Speaker, the village of Northope Hall in my constituency has about 1,000 residents. Last year, Northope Hall Hotel on the edge of the village was bought, and there are now proposals to house 400 single male migrants in the building and in shipping containers stacked around the grounds. The village has one small shop, no transport links, and a health board in complete meltdown. Can the Prime Minister facilitate a meeting for myself and some local residents with the Home Secretary to hear the concerns of the local residents who are worried that the government just isn't listening to them?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises exactly why we need to take action, because it's not right that our local hotels in all our communities are being used to such a degree to house illegal asylum seekers, not least because it's costing the British taxpayer something like £5.5 or £6 million a day. We want to put an end to that, and that's why we're bringing forward legislation that will enable us to swiftly detain and send back those who should not be here, but I will make sure that he gets a meeting with the Immigration Minister as he needs.
Jerry McCarthy.
Trussell Trust figures out today show that their food banks gave out a record number of meals over the past year. It's nearly 3 million meals, 1 million of which went to children. Now, the Prime Minister's fortunate, he's a wealthy man, but all these families want to be able to do is to put food on their table, to be able to feed their own children without having to resort to food banks. Does he think that's too much to ask?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously, we absolutely do want anyone to have to rely on a food bank, but whilst there are people who do use them, I'm very grateful to all of those who volunteer their time to make sure that they are provided in their local communities. We've put substantial provision in place, not least infant free school meals and broader free school meals, which are helping almost 2 million children, but also last year the investment in the Holiday Activity and Food Programme, which provides not just food but also activities outside of term time, and we'll continue to do everything we can to help those in low pay, which is why we're raising the national living wage to record levels, and I'm pleased to say that those living in poverty today is 2 million lower than when we first came into office.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, e-cigarettes were introduced as a stop smoking device, but they're remarkably cheap, brightly coloured vapes with flavours such as unicorn milkshake, bubble gum and green gummy bear have proved remarkably attractive to children, hooking them on a lifetime of potentially harmful nicotine addiction. Will my honourable friend meet with me to talk about how work across government departments can help to stop our children becoming hooked on vapes? And will he back my 10-minute rule bill to ban disposable vapes?
Prime Minister.
Can I commend my honourable friend for her work in this area? I absolutely recognise the concern that she raises, both on the environmental impact of disposable vapes, but also their appeal to children. DHSC have announced a call for evidence to look at reducing youth vaping, including vape appearance, flavours and marketing. We've also been clear that all electrical waste should be disposed of properly, and DEFRA are looking actively at what changes in legislation might be needed to ensure that the vaping sector foots the bill for the collection and treatment of their used products.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we celebrate the lives of Lily Savage and Dame Edna Everidge, Turning Point UK are planning to protest at a drag storytime event in my constituency on Saturday for the 3rd time this year. These events are friendly, inclusive opportunities for children to hear a story and learn about equality. Turning Point UK members, by contrast, seek to intimidate our young people. They share misleading images on social media, implying the events are inappropriate. So will the Prime Minister condemn Turning Point UK's attempts to spread hatred and division in my constituency and across the country?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of the specific allegations the Honourable Lady brings to light, but in general, we should treat everybody with respect and understanding and compassion, Mr. Speaker, and people should be allowed to gather and associate freely within the bounds of the law and in But when it comes to children, as we've said, it's important that the material that children are exposed to in classrooms is sensitive and age appropriate, and that's why we're reviewing the RHSE guidance currently.
James Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This year marks the 400th anniversary of the publication of Shakespeare's first folio, and his plays are not only a central part of our national culture, but many people around the world see them as a beacon of hope in darkest times. I recently met with Professor Natalia Tokrut, the director of the Shakespeare Institute in Ukraine, who told stories of actors, directors and scholars putting on Shakespeare plays in air raid shelters in Ukraine as an act of defiance against Russian aggression and bombs. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that, notwithstanding the sound and fury of domestic politics, that in Shakespeare's works we have a force for freedom in a world often dominated by the brutality and tyranny of oppressive regimes?
Can I join my honourable friend in his comments? And coincidentally, one of the first gifts that I gave President Zelensky was an old copy of Henry V. And so I think his comments are well made. And that's why we're training and arming the Ukrainian forces with the equipment they need to push back Russian forces. And we know, and I know the whole House will join me in saying, that the people of Ukraine's incredible strength and inspiring bravery will ultimately defeat tyranny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month marks 23 years since the passing of the late, great Bernie Grant, a former member of this House and the founder of the UK reparations movement in the UK. In his last Prime Minister's questions before his death, he asked for an apology to the people of African descent, living and dead, for our country's role in slavery and colonialism. But since then, Prime Ministers and heads of state have only ever expressed sorrow or deep regret. These are not sentiments that are befitting one of the greatest atrocities in human history. And there's been no acknowledgement of the wealth that has been amassed, or the fact that our country took out the largest loan it ever has to pay off the slave owners and not the enslaved. So I want to ask the Prime Minister today if he will do what Bernie Grant asked all those years ago, what I have asked and what countless others have asked since, and offer a full and meaningful apology for our country's role in slavery and colonialism, and commit to reparatory justice.
No, Mr. Speaker. What I think our focus should now be on doing is, of course, understanding our history in all its parts, not running away from it, but right now making sure that we have a society which is inclusive and tolerant of people from all backgrounds. That's something that we on this House, our side of the House, are committed to doing and will continue to deliver, but trying to unpick our history is not the right way forward, and it's not something that we will focus our energies on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will recall his visit to Rugby to see our great work in delivering new homes and the new community of Holton, where 1,000 of 6,000 homes are now occupied. But regrettably, urgent care services at our local hospital of St Cross are not keeping pace with this growth. And as a consequence, 80,000 of my constituents now live more than 15 minutes drive from a major A&E unit. May I therefore invite the Prime Minister to return to Rugby to see for himself the need to upgrade our emergency care provision.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely vital that people can access the NHS services they need, particularly emergency care, and that's why we're investing an extra £1 billion, a dedicated funding to support urgent emergency care services. My honourable friend will know that the specific provision is a matter for local NHS commissioners and providers, because plans for those things need to be developed locally and take into account the expanding needs of local populations. And I know that my honourable friend will continue to engage with his local NHS trust to ensure the views of his constituents and communities are well known and adequately provided for.
Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, every day I meet with constituents struggling to make ends meet, food banks barely managing to meet the demands, households and businesses up and down this country struggling to meet their energy bills. Yet the Bank of England has already announced that it is likely to increase interest rates once again, which will affect the poorest most and hike up mortgage rates once again. Does the Prime Minister, after 13 years of Conservatives government, agree with the Bank of England's chief economist that the poorest should just accept being poorer?
Mr. Speaker, we're doing an enormous amount to support those who most need our help with the cost of living and some of the pressures, particularly on energy bills that they face. That's why we made a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies and use that money to help pay around half of a typical family's energy bill. That is support worth £1,500. It applies across the United Kingdom. And on top of that, there are direct payments going to the most vulnerable families in our society. Just yesterday, the first of those payments was put out, £300, the first of 3 payments, and that went to 1 in 3 households, Mr. Speaker, including many in Scotland, and that is our Conservative government delivering for the people of Scotland and making sure they have the help they need to manage some of the pressures that they're facing.
Sir Robert Goodwin.
In Yorkshire, we say you should judge a person by the company that they keep. So what would be the Prime Minister's view of an individual who can not only bear to spend more than 10 minutes in the presence of Vladimir Putin, but refers to him as a dear friend?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think our views on President Putin are well known. His illegal war in Ukraine has caused untold misery for many people. It's caused a humanitarian crisis and is still ongoing in defiance of international condemnation and sanction, Mr. Speaker. We will do everything we can to bring those responsible for war crimes to justice, continue to support Ukraine militarily, and make sure that we can support them all the way to victory, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the whole House is united in wanting that outcome.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the chronic lack of capacity in the NHS, the Prime Minister will be aware that community pharmacies can help deal with minor illnesses. But there is a problem. On average, 10 pharmacies close every month in England. Will he take urgent action to prevent further closures and commission a properly funded Pharmacy First service for minor illnesses?
Mr. Speaker, it's a rare agreement between the honourable gentleman and myself that I'm a wholehearted champion and believer in the role that community pharmacists can play, and we want to make sure that they can do everything to ease some of the pressures in primary care. It's something that we're actively talking to the sector about. We'll always continue to do everything we can to support community pharmacies. I know firsthand how respected they are in their communities, and I think they can do more for us over time.
Sarah Atherton.
OK, Mr. Speaker, after a 15-year break, Wrexham Association Football Club is back in the English football. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating everyone at the club, including the loyal supporters and the owners, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney? And does he agree that Wrexham is no longer a neglected place, but quickly becoming a jewel in the crown of the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I join my honourable friend in congratulating everyone at Wrexham, from the owners to the players to supporters and everyone in the community. It's been an incredible ride. We've all enjoyed watching them, and we wish them every future success, Mr. Speaker. And I join with her in saying they are indeed a jewel in the crown, and she deserves enormous credit for championing them in this place.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After an investigation ordered by the Prime Minister himself, a senior Conservative MP was found guilty of bullying, found guilty of behaviour that was persistently aggressive and intimidating. The MP in question then attempted to blame his victims, and a whole string of Conservative MPs queued up to defend him, suggesting that his conduct was not only acceptable but was actually good management practice. What does it say about the Prime Minister's own values that he has done nothing to distance himself from those comments?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when formal complaints were made, I rightly initiated an independent investigation, and as soon as it reported, action was taken. That's the right thing to do, to follow due process and then let the process play out, Mr. Speaker. But I do think it is somewhat odd to be getting lectures on values right now from the SNP.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Those please leave.
And that brings us to the end of this week's session of Prime Minister's Questions. I'd like to welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Health Minister Maria Caulfield, and for the Labour Party, the Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. Welcome to you. And Vicky Young, my colleague at the BBC, Deputy Political Editor. It was personal again between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. I suppose we are in local election period 2, to add a sort of extra layer of spice, if you like. Trading insults this time on the economy. That's what Keir Starmer decided to go on. There were quotes like Mr. 24 tax rises, he called Rishi Sunak, for the fact that the UK has the highest tax burden for about 70 years, and Rishi Sunak retorting with Labour always running out of other people's money. What do you think the public will make of this?
Well, it feels a bit like an extension of last week. We talked about this, didn't we, with the attack ads and how things were becoming more personal. And yes, you're right, we are coming up to local elections, but I think all the parties are looking at this set of elections as a bit of a run-through, if you like, for a general election, which some do expect to be in a year's time, actually. And I thought what was very striking about Sir Keir Starmer's attack was the personal nature of it. Now, you do expect him, of course, to talk about the Conservatives' record and the economy, the fact that people feel poorer, but it's the way that he was going for Rishi Sunak about his personal wealth, actually. He didn't
on the
say
non-dom
it,
status.
but talking about the non-dom status, talking about, you know, you're clueless about life, outside of your bubble, you're out of touch, you don't understand food prices. And then, as you say, the non-dom status, which helped you and your family. And I think that's definitely becoming a bit of a sharper attack from Labour, which suggests to me that polling is showing that it's maybe hitting home with some voters. Now, Rishi Sunak doesn't really respond to any of that. I mean, he can't, can he? He can't get away from the fact that he's phenomenally wealthy. All he can do is talk about the help the government is giving to those who are less fortunate than he is. So talking to cost of living payments, other payments that have been going out just this week. So really trying to look at the track record of the Conservatives, despite all the problems there have been with the pandemic and then with the Ukraine war, and saying, look, we are helping people who need it. But I think it's very interesting that Labour seem to think that they're getting somewhere with the more personal attacks.
And we'll come back to this issue with both Maria Caulfield and Bridget Phillipson in a moment, because I want to focus a little bit on what's happening this afternoon, or now, shortly, I think, in the House of Commons, and that is what the government calls the Small Boats Bill, or the Illegal Migration Bill, to give it its proper title, because it's reaching its final stages in the House of Commons this afternoon. But there are potentially two significant rebellions to deal with first. We're going to talk to one of those potential rebels, Tim Lawton, in a few minutes' time. Tell us a little bit about those.
Well, the point about this, the big picture about this bill, is this is something that the government really wants to make work, if you like. You know, we know those promises from Rishi Sunak, including, you know, stop the boats. Well, I think that's one of his 5 pledges. It's the one that ministers are most concerned about, because it's going to be so difficult. Lots of different things need to work for that to happen. And as you say, there's anxiety in the Conservative Party on different sides. So on one side of it, there are those who want the bill tightened up, and they feel actually quite reassured. They think Suella Braverman is going to do that by talking about ignoring some of these rulings from the ECHR. So they are happier at the moment. But the other side of it is about having more safe and legal routes. It's about child detention, really trying to sort of make it, soften it up, if you like. That's the other side. I think that's the side where there's likely to be more of a rebellion, although I think it's going to be a rebellion postponed potentially to the House of Lords. Because don't forget, this is the House of Commons, the House of Lords comes next, and there lots of people are expecting it to get a very, very difficult time. So what happens is that you have these concessions promised for further down the line quite often, and it's all about whether the rebels believe that they're going to happen.
Well, let's talk to one of them. As I said, the Conservative MP Tim Lawton has an amendment seeking to restrict the detention of unaccompanied child migrants arriving on UK shores. Tim, is the government going to give in to your amendment and meet your demands?
Well, I hope, after intensive discussions over the last few days, that the government will confirm and give assurances at the dispatch box when the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, gets up later today, that they are addressing some of the concerns that our amendments actually raise, and they will come back at the next stage of the bill, when it's in the Lords, with amendments to put those assurances onto the face of the bill.
Right,
so I should be listening carefully.
Yes, of course. As it stands now, Tim, are you going to push for a vote on your amendment this afternoon?
I reserve the right to do that, along with many other colleagues who have signed those amendments, but I hope that I won't have to, because we'll get the assurances that we need. There are two big separate areas here. There's safe and legal routes. The government agreed to that last week. That's a really significant measure to go on the face of the bill, and balances the bill with the really serious, robust measures we need to take to clamp down on the people smugglers and those illegitimate
I'll come back
claims.
to yes, right. I'll come back to the safe and legal routes in just a moment. I know it's very noisy behind you, but I hope you can still hear me. Have you any other concerns about the measures in this bill? As you know, the Equality and Human Rights Commission have warned the bill could breach the UK's human rights obligations. So, if the government does agree and gives you reassurances on child migrants and their detention, are you then happy to vote for the bill?
I'm going to vote for this bill because we need measures to go through. The situation at the moment, as I've said on your programme many times, Joe, is unsustainable. We cannot have large amounts of people coming across the channel in a dangerous way, paying people smugglers to do it, many of whom do not have credible claims for asylum in the UK, and it's gumming up the whole system. So we've got to have some measures. Just saying all this is terrible, but doing nothing about it is not enough. But what I've tried to achieve with the amendments here is to make sure that those genuine asylum seekers, and I gave the example of the 16-year-old East African orphan, and that's become a reality in the last week with kids being affected in Sudan as well. How would that child be able safely and legally to come to the UK, particularly if they had a relative here? And by putting safe and legal routes on the face of the bill, provides those possibilities in the future. So that's really significant. And on child detention, we've got to make a clear distinction that you cannot treat children in the same way as adults, even when they're in the asylum system. So there are safeguards, which we've always had within the Children Act of 1989, and we've got to make sure that those safeguards will apply to those children as well. There are good reasons why some children who may abscond, who may end up in criminal gangs, will need to be detained, but we have to do it in an appropriate way, in an appropriate place, with appropriate safeguards about getting permissions from courts. And again, that's what my amendments do, and that's what I think the government is now going to agree to and add those things in the law. So I'm happy at the moment. There are lots of other things that will get amended, but my major asks, I hope, have been addressed. We'll get confirmation at the dispatch box later on today.
Vicky Young, my colleague, is here and wants to ask you about the safe and legal routes, the way you have just outlined that example of a 16-year-old, possibly from Sudan, possibly from Eritrea.
Yeah, Tim, just on the concession that the government is talking about, my understanding is that they promised to launch a consultation within 3 months of the bill getting royal assent, and then reporting within 6 months, setting out current and any proposed additional safe and legal routes. I mean, that sounds like that's quite a long way down the track, isn't it? Because it comes after royal assent. They're not actually promising to increase the number of safe and legal routes, or do you have a different understanding of that?
So there are ideally, and I put down amendments at the earlier committee stage, I'd like the two things to come in at the same time. So we have the legislation goes through, and then these safe and legal routes are up and running. There is a lot of work still to be done, and frankly it should have been done earlier. We've got to see what capacity there is, and Parliament's going to be able to have a vote on the numbers too, because we've still got an awful lot of people from Afghanistan here legitimately in hotels. We need to consult with refugee organisations how best to make sure we're getting to the right people, but it has to be done within 6 months, tops, that they set out exactly how they're going to do this, through extension of family union schemes, through a Dubs 2 type scheme, through the UNHCR going and identifying refugees in vulnerable areas more proactively. These are all ways of making sure we're getting to the people who really do need the safety of coming to the UK and have a claim to come to the UK. So actually we've gone a long, long way, because that's just not available at the moment.
All right. Tim Lawton, thank you very much for joining us there from Central Lobby. Maria Crawford, I just want to put this to you from Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister in Conservative Home. He said, put simply, excessive uncontrolled migration threatens to cannibalise the compassion of the British public. Would you use those words?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use those words, but it's a genuine concern. I mean, obviously, we've got local elections.
He says cannibalise the compassion of the British public. What would you say to people who say Robert Jenrick is inflaming and dividing people on this issue?
But I do think we need to recognise that this is a massive issue. I've been door knocking up and down my constituency for the local elections. Yeah. You know, it's such a big issue, and I think there are. Well,
is it a big issue because the government keeps making it a big issue but can't actually deal with the problem?
Well, it's a big issue in my part of the country because we've got hotels that are filled with migrants.
Whose fault's that?
Well, absolutely. That's why we're bringing in this legislation, because we're spending £6 million a day on hotel accommodation for migrants, and that is not sustainable. And the British public know that, and that's why we're passing this legislation at speed, because we absolutely recognise that this is something that needs to be dealt with, we need to have better control of the illegal migration.
Well, do you want to distance yourself from those words, or do you think they're fine?
No, I mean, I've just said they're not words that I would use, but I do recognise that the general public do have a concern about the level of illegal immigration in the country at the moment.
Do you agree with that this is a big issue? Keir Starmer and the Labour Party want to stop the small boats but won't back the policies that have been outlined in this bill?
Because the government have had 13 years, and it's a symptom of failure that we've even got to this point. As Maria was just saying, we're spending millions of pounds on housing people in unsuitable accommodation such as hotels because we're not processing asylum claims. It's the government that's broken that system in the first place.
So why won't you back the bill?
Well, I don't like that kind of language, first and foremost.
Sure
I really don't like it, and I don't think that advances the kind of debate that we should be having in this country.
Right.
I do believe that we need to have controls on migration.
Right.
I believe we should crack down on criminal gangs that are exploiting people's misery.
Yeah. But you haven't got a suggestion for how?
We would make sure we've got that cross-border working with the French in particular to deliver an improvement.
The government have made a deal with the French to improve the numbers of people policing their shores.
They've had 13 years, and the numbers that we see now and the fact that people are waiting so long for claims to be processed, that we've got to this position in the first place, is a symptom of failure. And that's why we'll be opposing what the government is setting out. We went round the Houses on this just a year ago, very similar discussion that we had. It feels like we're talking about this all the time and nothing actually ever happens.
I mean, if you look at the work that since the Prime Minister came into post, we've since the deal with Albania, we've returned over 1,000 Albanians. We've got it getting through that backlog. There's 12,000 less people on that backlog now. Since
when's the first flight going to Rwanda?
Well, that's the key question. That's why we need this legislation, because we tried to get flights to Rwanda and we were stopped by the European Court of Human Rights. That's why we need this legislation, so that we have the supremacy here in the UK to make those decisions. Like the British courts upheld the government's decision, and we need to be able. And
it's in the Court of Appeal. I mean, we heard Tim Lawton there say if the government does meet the demands on child migrants being treated differently and not being detained if they arrive on our shores, and also there are safe and legal routes more than exist at the moment, would you reverse this bill if you win the next election, if it's passed?
We'll be taking action to deal with whatever mess that we inherit, and frankly, this is going to be an awful lot of problems that the next Labour government's going to have to fix after all of these years of failure. We're opposing it. We think there's still an opportunity to make sure that it doesn't come into force. It's still going through its various stages, as Vicky was just saying there. I think that discussion that you had with Tim Lawton, I don't think he's really getting the concessions that he thinks he's getting on any of this. We need serious action from the government to tackle this. We aren't seeing that, and this is just a symptom of the failure we've seen year after year after year. And what do we have instead? Government ministers stoking this, inflaming tensions, rather than actually taking action to make sure we do have a proper system in this country for processing cases quickly and fairly, so that people don't have to wait for years on end. I don't want to live in a country where people have to spend months and months and months waiting for cases to be heard. And in many cases, they are people that have got good grounds to be in this country. Where they don't have grounds to be in this country, let's process their cases, let's take action on that.
Well, let's go through some of the sort of practical elements. As you say, you're blaming the courts for blocking flights going to Rwanda. But in order to send people to Rwanda, you'll have to build some sort of detention capacity here while people wait. How many people do you expect will be detained in the UK?
Well, I don't have a figure for that, but we are building that capacity.
Are you?
So we know that, there's, a number of sites within the UK that have been announced quite recently that will be taking people. So we want to decant the hotels.
There's quite a lot of opposition, I think, from MPs in the constituencies where these sites have been identified.
To the British taxpayer.
Well, they're Tory MPs, I think, quite a lot of them.
We're spending £6 million a day on hotel accommodation.
But you're going to spend more on it.
Well, we are processing claims quicker. We've taken 12,000 people off the list already. custody. And what I'm hearing from Labour is that their solution is to just process people quicker. They don't actually want to stop the boats in the first place. And that's the nub of the problem, is that we have to stop the illegal people trafficking of very vulnerable people, and to make sure that is stopped, and then tackle the backlog of claims as well, not instead of.
Yet again, what we hear is a total failure from the government to take.
You haven't got a single policy.
You're a government minister, Maria. You are responsible.
You want to be in government.
If you let me answer,
all you want to do is object, but you don't have a policy of your own.
If you let me answer, you're a government minister. Your party have been in power now for 13 years. You've had ample opportunity to deliver a better system. What Labour would do would be to crack down on those criminal gangs that exploit misery.
I hear this. How would you crack down, though? How would you actually stop the people smuggling business?
We would end the Rwanda scheme, which isn't going to work, and we would put that money into cross-border working with the French to stop the gangs upstream, to make sure that they're not exploiting people's misery.
How do you stop the demand? How do you stop the demand that will still be there for people to be brought across the channel?
That has to involve working internationally in cooperation with international partners. The government has trashed our record internationally. We have become a laughingstock in many places. We need to rebuild those relationships with our international partners, make sure that we are managing that, and also dealing with some of these humanitarian crises to stop people being forced to flee countries in the first place.
Should more safe and legal routes be written into the bill before it is passed, Maria?
Well, I know that's a discussion that is being had at the moment, and the Prime Minister, before this legislation was introduced, has committed to safe and legal routes. My understanding, and it's a live debate because we're going into to vote on it this afternoon, is that is likely to be on the face of the bill. And it's disappointing then that the Labour Party would then vote against that.
That's not what we just heard when Vicky put the point to Tim Lawton about what that amendment actually reflected. I think we were listening to different views.
They've committed to a report, and if there are going to be any more safe routes, then they will tell us what they are. But I don't know if that is, as you say, the commitment there, that there will be an increase, because the government talks a lot about what they're already doing, and the safe routes that do exist for those from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, but they're not talking an awful lot about other routes.
Well, one final thing on this, because there is very much a live example of where there will be an increase, potentially, probably realistically, in terms of people claiming asylum, and those are young people and people generally from Sudan. Is the government, and should the government, be looking at a safe and legal route there to start with?
Well, our priority at the moment is extracting British national and British passport holders out of Sudan, and we've got flights going at the moment while the ceasefire is holding. There are discussions with the Foreign Secretary and his international counterparts about how to support the region as a whole, ideally to stop the conflict in the first place. So that is an ongoing piece of work at the moment, but our priority is getting British nationals and British passport holders out of the country.
I said we would return to the discussion on the economy. Let's look at some of the claims and counterclaims that were made between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer quoting George Osborne, former Conservative Chancellor, whom he said talked to a select committee of MPs, saying that the Tories were a bunch of vandals on the economy. Well, if George Osborne thinks that, as a former Chancellor for the Conservative government, who am I to disagree with?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's been very clear on his 5 priorities, and tackling inflation, which is the biggest enemy to every household and to every business in this country at the moment, is his absolute priority. And we saw this week that he's extra help for those who are really struggling at the moment. There's £8 million £8 million people as of yesterday who will be getting £900 extra help and support, and that's on top of paying half of people's energy bills through the last year. So there is, this is different times to probably when George Osborne was Chancellor. These are times when we've just dealt with 2 years of a pandemic where we've had to shut down our economy. We've now got the conflict in Ukraine, and the energy prices have driven inflation. They're not normal economic times, and so we are having to make different decisions to what would happen in stable times.
Do you think he's also referring to the fact that Keir Starmer talked about 24 tax rises? Rather than being a low taxation party, we have the highest tax burden we've had in 70 years.
Well, we've also, we've got local elections at the moment, and you can see on the doorstep that those councils that are run by Conservative councils have significantly lower council tax than Labour councils. In my patch, my council's run by the Lib Dems and the Greens, and they're third highest council tax in the country.
Council tax, but I mean, I'm talking about the overall tax burden.
That's a form of taxation. But we have actually reduced taxation as well in the last few years. If you look, we've raised the income tax thresholds. They were £6,500 when we came in.
Yeah, you've frozen them.
No, and we raised them to £12,500. Last year, we raised the national insurance to the same levels of income tax. That gave people hundreds of pounds extra a year.
But millions more are paying more tax.
Absolutely. But where we can, we are reducing tax. But we have to recognise...
Well, you're not, because it's the highest tax burden, as I said. You may be reducing it in some areas, but it's far being outdone by freezing people's tax thresholds where they're paying far more tax. More people are paying more tax.
Yeah, and, you know, the Chancellor has been clear that he's going to look at that in the coming months. But we have to be responsible. We saw what happened in a budget where we gave money away. Because to reduce tax, we either have to borrow money from somewhere else or take it out of existing pots.
That was your budget. That was your government's budget.
So, you know, and I think the Prime Minister has been very clear that mistakes were made during that time. But what we cannot do is give tax breaks at the moment when the economy is just about to recover. When we get inflation down, that is the time to look at tax cuts, which will be in the coming months.
Let's hope these 24 tax rises, Mr. 24 tax rises, Keir Starmer called Rishi Sunak. Which of those would you reverse?
We want to see a much fairer tax system that doesn't see the
question.
burden.
Are you going to reverse the 24 tax
people.
rises that you've just accused him of putting in place?
I tell you one change we'd make, that what Rishi Sunak referred to as the non-dom thing. I mean, he has benefited to the tune of up to £20 million by one estimate from his failure to end that non-dom tax status.
And that raises £3.2 billion. Beyond that, what would you do?
So we would put that money, going to the non-dom point, we would put that money into delivering the biggest expansion in a generation of the NHS workforce. We'd make sure that families are supported during the cost of living crisis with breakfast clubs for every primary school child.
What about reversing? He's accusing Rishi Sunak of presiding over endless increases in taxes. So you'd add another one by scrapping the non-dom status, rightly or wrongly.
Rishi Sunak I think he can afford that.
Well, that's not what I'm asking you.
But
what I'm asking you is working people, which ones are you going to reverse?
We will deliver a fairer tax system across the board, whether that's ending the carried interest loophole, whether that's ending the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, ending the non-dom tax status, fairer business rates. We would freeze council tax.
They're not tax cuts, though, are they? What I'm saying is, where are you going to reverse increases in taxes? I mean, there was one suggestion from Francis O'Grady. I know that was another tax increase. You're right, they're all tax increases from Labour. Where are the tax cuts?
What we want to make sure is that we have a fairer tax system across the board. We have actually committed to cutting business rates for small businesses to make a difference to our high street. So there's a more level playing field where it comes to the online giants that don't pay, I think, their fair share of tax. But overall, we will inherit, the next Labour government, if we secure the trust of the British people, will inherit a very difficult climate because of the crashed economy that the Conservatives have delivered, because of 13 years of failure, where people have seen stagnant wages, where taxes are going up on working people, and where at the same time, people know that they are worse off. It's all very good and well for Rishi Sunak to stand at the dispatch box and pretend that everything's wonderful and people should just be grateful for where we are. People out there, your viewers know that it's pretty tough at the moment. Every time they go to the shop and they put things back because they can't afford it, their taxes are going up. Everything is more expensive and record levels of people going to food banks.
You mentioned wages and pay. Let's just show you changes in pay since 2010, since there have been Conservative governments, the first one being a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I mean, Maria, looking at that graph, looking at all public sector workers, down by 7.7%, is it any wonder people are on strike?
Well, no, we recognise why the public sector workers are asking for a pay rise, and that's why we've been in negotiations. It's why we're disappointed, for example, with the RCN when they agreed a deal on pay, that when they put it to their members, that was rejected.
The leadership recommended it, and it was rejected because they felt it wasn't enough, and perhaps that's the reason. Do you think it needs to be increased, the offer?
Well, the difficulty we have at the moment is inflation, and if we're seeing fuel and energy prices coming down, and so we're confident inflation will drop pretty significantly quite soon. If we then replace that with wages driving inflation, no one will be better off, and they might get a 10-15% pay rise, but they'll be paying for it in the shops, in their bills, and in every other way.
So Hugh Pill, the chief economist at the Bank of England, agrees with that workers should just accept that we are poorer, that they shouldn't be asking for inflation-matching pay rises. Do you agree with that?
Well, after 13 years of Conservative government, it's clear that people are worse off. Working people are worse off.
Yeah, I think should they be asking for inflation-matching pay rises?
I think to the point around inflation, the chart that you just showed demonstrated the changes that we've seen since 2010. So this is not just people who are dissatisfied because of what's taken place over the last year or two. This is because over the course of more than a decade, people that do brilliant work, like our teachers and nurses, the people that we praised and clapped during the pandemic, have suffered real terms pay cuts. And they are just fed up of feeling so underappreciated.
So you'll reverse it. If you win next year, let's just assume it's next year in spring or autumn, you'll reverse that drop by 7.7%. I mean, all private sector workers have only had 1.9% since 2010, 13 years. You'll reverse that.
The next Labour government will face a very, very difficult inheritance because of the way the Conservatives have crashed the economy.
When we came into power, we had a recession and a post-it note saying there is no money left. Let's not forget what the Labour government did to this country.
The brass neck, Maria. People are right now paying more on their rent and their mortgages because of your party and the decisions that you all took last year with Liz Truss. That is the real-life impact that people are seeing right now. The decisions that you took that are costing people
Well, we had to close down the economy.
Speak to people, see what they say about it.
Let her respond. The government would say they've reversed a lot of that. But go on, Maria.
So we had to close down the economy for 2 years during COVID. We paid people's bills through furlough. We supported businesses with businesses grants. These are not normal economic times, and we are now getting the country back on track from that. That's not to dismiss the impact the last Labour government that gave us a recession that took us years to come out of.
Everyone would expect, and this happened across the world, that when you have a global pandemic like that, governments step in and take action to protect people. Absolutely, and we back the government on many of those measures. But to pretend that the consequences from that mini-budget, that reckless, absolutely irresponsible mini-budget, haven't had real-life consequences for people, their rent and their mortgage, and on public sector pay, I'm not, for that reason, because you see what happens when you make reckless commitments. I am not going to commit to things I cannot be confident I can deliver. But if you look at the record of the last Labour government, over the 13 years that we were in power, teachers saw real terms.
Yes, but of course that was a different time and it was a long time ago.
It was a different time, and we made it's about political priorities. It's about the difference that governments can make, different choices, a different set of priorities.
Historically, of course, people will say you inherited an economy that was on the rise in '97. I mean, we can go back in history, of course.
The next Labour government will certainly not be inheriting
an economy on the rise. I think you wanted to update us briefly on a story that we did before Prime Minister's Questions on Labour membership numbers. We said there were 430,000, and you have an updated figure for us?
My understanding is that they were old numbers, and actually we're seeing really strong numbers where it comes to our membership.
But they're the last published figures, aren't they?
My understanding is that is not quite correct. When we saw a big increase, the biggest number that we've ever seen in one day when Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. We're a strong and buoyant party. We're making big strides across the country, and Keir Starmer's transformed the Labour Party.
What are your membership numbers?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, that's honest, at least. Thank you all for joining me, both of you, and to you, Vicky Young. That's all for today, but I'll be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and iPlayer. In fact, I'll be back tomorrow, I think.
Your smart speaker is seriously